Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming online for today's video or webinar. The topic today is around the impact of COVID-19 on Northern Queensland, particularly my home city of Cairns. Now, my name is Todd Kelly, and also with me today is Ben Schuhuber. We are both from BDO North Queensland, based in Cairns. What we're hoping to do is that in the next 40 minutes that you'll have a better understanding of what's happening in the north of Queensland. Some background to me: I've been doing business restructuring and insolvency for over 30 years. I started my career in Brisbane with the firm that is now BDO in Brisbane. And for the last 20 years, I've been based in Cairns. Ben's been with me coming on to 9 years. In regards to our firm up here in the north of the state, we are the largest accounting practice in Cairns. We've got almost 80 staff. I've got a business restructuring team up here of 8 people, and we are also supported by other staff from other areas of this office, plus also supported by Andrew Fielding's team in Brisbane and the other BDO business restructuring teams nationally. What we're looking at covering today is where was Cairns 5 months ago? So January 2020, what did the landscape in Cairns look like? What's the impact on Cairns businesses from COVID-19? We'll also look at other areas around Cairns and in the north of the state. So Port Douglas, Atherton Tablelands, Weipa, Townsville, Mackay and the Whitsundays. And then at the end, we'll look at what does the future hold. So Cairns, January 2020. Let's have a look at what that looked like. Back then, now that's only 5 months ago. To me, it seems as though that was like a year ago. It just seems that time has slowed up in the last 3 or 4 months. So back in January 2020, the Cairns economy was pretty steady. Some used the word patchy. There had been a slowdown in tourist numbers. Construction activity had softened. There was a plateau in employment. But what we need to remember there is that unemployment at that stage was well below state and Australian levels, and our gross regional product growth was above Queensland and Australian levels. There was also a lot of capital works happening. So we had the upgrade happening for the Cairns Convention Centre. There was a big road construction being the Smithfield bypass. There was the widening of the southern access coming into Cairns from the south, and also works were well underway or in the planning phase in regards to the expansion of the highway further south between Edmonton and Gordonvale. So there was a lot of government money being thrown into Cairns at that time. The airport upgrade was also nearing completion, and there was a lot of investment happening in the shipyard space. What we also had seen over the last couple of years was a gentleman in exile from Syria, and so he's based himself in Dubai, Ghassan Aboud. He was finishing off the last of his 3 new 5-star hotels in the CBD. In regards to property prices back in January, we had finally seen them achieve GFC levels or just better than that after a slow grind. But what was also happening there was we had seen international flights cancelled. So Cathay Pacific, after 25 years of servicing Cairns, in and out of Cairns with direct flights, pulled out entirely. Also, domestic carriers, Qantas, Jetstar, Tiger, Virgin had also chopped back the number of flights in and out of Cairns. Over the last couple of years, we've been a little bit excited about a potential global tourism hub, which was going to involve a new, larger casino and entertainment precinct, much like what's happening down in Brisbane, which I think is the one done by Star down there. We had hopes that an international player was going to come in and revitalise the Cairns CBD. There was talk there of casino operators from Las Vegas, Macau, Cambodia, I think, and ultimately that's now dead in the water and not happening. Towards the end of January, what we also had up here was a drop-off in bookings because globally people were looking at Australia and thinking the whole of Australia was on fire because of the bushfires, and that was starting to have an impact on the Cairns tourism market. Bang. After that, we get hit pretty shortly after with COVID-19. In regards to that and the impact on Cairns businesses, Cairns is expected to go deeper and longer in the recovery process. So February and March are traditionally quieter months. There has been over the last decade an improvement on that because of Chinese New Year celebrations. Last year was a bit slower. There was actually a drop-off in Chinese tourists last year into this. And of course, this year you had the Chinese flights were all cancelled. So there was just no Chinese New Year up here, February, March. I suppose one of the big things I want people to get out of this today is that whilst there's worrying signs for Cairns, it's not all doom and gloom up here in Cairns. And when I speak to my family down in the southeast corner of the state, they just think it's all doom and gloom, and that's not the case. Tourism is obviously doing it very, very hard, but other areas, as we will talk about later on in this presentation, are going fine and some are actually going strong. If we just look at Cairns and what it has as a base in regards to sectors, I was reading something last week about the top sectors by jobs, and I just want to give you guys an impression of what Cairns is about, because most people think Cairns is just about tourism, and that's not necessarily the case. So for last year, as regards to employment, tourism directly and indirectly made up 15%. Healthcare was 15%, so the same as tourism. Construction, 11%, retail trade, 11%, accommodation and food services, 10%, education and training, 8%, public administration safety, 8%, and so on. Manufacturing was 5%. So I just want to put across the impression there that Cairns is not all about tourism. So if we go back to the impact of COVID-19, what we do see, however, is that for those in tourism, those businesses were just shut immediately. So there was this massive impact on Barrier Reef cruise operators, wildlife parks. You may have all heard of Skyrow and Cranta. They've just shut down totally immediately. So whilst government support has helped in some areas, many of these major tourism-based businesses in and around Cairns are still closed, although they are looking at reopening shortly. The flow-on effect to Cairns as a whole has been large because directly or indirectly, a fair bit does tie into Cairns, but probably not as much as people think. The Cairns Regional Council recently commissioned a report by ID Consulting. So I just want to go through some aspects of that report, because I think that's what hits the mark on a few fronts. So what that report said was that Cairns will be one of the most severely affected regions in Australia, as its economy is heavily reliant on tourism and other export sectors. Because what we need to bear in mind here is that Cairns was one of the first regions in Australia to be impacted by the national and global responses to COVID-19, as we had flights early on from China and from places like Japan, Bali, just come to a grinding halt, as did the flights from domestic routes like Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne. In that report, it identifies Cairns as being the second most severely impacted regional city in Australia. That's in terms of jobs and revenue. That's for the June quarter 2020. Gold Coast was number 1. But for us sitting here in Cairns, our issue is that we don't have a major metropolitan centre on our doorstep. So put that in perspective, Cairns, I would say within 4 hours drive, has probably 400 to 500,000 people maximum that it can draw upon. The Gold Coast in that southeast corner, I understand, is probably close to 3.5 million to 4 million people. Those people can get in the car and drive an hour from Brisbane down to the Gold Coast, an hour and a half to the Sunshine Coast, an hour and a half to the Darling Downs. Cairns does not have the benefit of that. and I'm not sure there's going to be heaps of people in Brisbane in the next couple of weeks hopping on their cars and driving up to Cairns for a holiday. So we lack that, you know, that self-drive sort of holiday thing. We need planes, and more planes. So domestic tourism will be critical to Cairns' short to medium-term recovery. So what we need to also bear in mind here is that with the GFC, it took us about 10 years to get back to where we were. So we don't want that to happen again, particularly in regards to tourism-based businesses. We need targeted support, okay? If we don't get that from the government, then, you know, it may well take us years to get back to where we were. The report also went into unemployment in Cairns and said that unemployment in Cairns was expected to go from what was under state averages to over 12%, and without JobKeeper, it was estimated it would go to over 15% in the June 2020 quarter. So time will tell on that. So when we get those figures coming through in a month or so time, or a couple months time, it'd be interesting to see what they are. Another point there is that local residents will be more likely to be out of work due to the region's industry mix, and they may also have less opportunity to get other jobs because we just don't have, you know, large communities close by. So we need domestic aviation to be back on its feet, as per the Premier's announcement last weekend. That's a good start, but we do need the borders of New South Wales, Victoria, and the other states open, because that is critical, and we'll talk about that shortly. We also have realised up here that we need investment in destination marketing. So what we had as a problem going back a couple of years ago was that rather than focus on destination marketing like come to Cairns, come to Cairns, come to North Queensland, come to Cairns, they changed it to be more on a product. And so it was come to the Great Barrier Reef, and that was confusing because people from overseas, whatever, didn't appreciate that. Well, we consider Cairns and Port Douglas to be the gateway to the Barrier Reef. They may have thought that Lady Heron Island or places 1,000 kilometres south, you know, were good enough to come to. And so we had people, because we weren't pushing destination marketing, we were seeing a drop off in tourism. So our tourism leaders now have taken upon themselves to be focused a lot more on that. There was 3 comments I come across recently from our mayor. I thought I'd just run them through with you. So the first one is basically saying, look, Cairns has been under the pump before. We had the pilot strike back in '89. It was crippled Cairns. We had the GFC, and we have cyclones on a regular basis. We need government help, and if we get that, and we get people coming up and helping us as well through tourism, we'll get back and we'll bounce back stronger than ever before. I think that's a pretty positive message. Our mayor also went on about the issue or the difference between Gold Coast bouncing back quicker than us in regards to there's a large number of people who can just hop in their cars and drive there, and that there is this need to get domestic flights from all Australia back into Cairns. I'll now pass over to Ben. He will look at the impact on specific industries.
Good morning, everyone. So we'll just duck through an overview of some of the more, I guess, visible industries that are in the North Queensland area. Starting with the quite visible reef boat operators. COVID pretty much put a pin in that straight away. So they stopped immediately, and the boats have been idle in the marina to a large extent. And the expectation is that the staff who are on JobKeeper are largely being used to do maintenance and things like that. So there's always going to be a little bit of downtime in the boats as they do maintenance. Some of the better positioned reef boat operators will be taking advantage of this period to knock over some of the routine maintenance that they need to do that would have been a loss of productivity anyway. So a little silver lining, but still not what they want to be doing. Some vessels have been redeployed to do reef protection work, which has been a welcome accommodation to some of the operators. And with the recent relaxation There's been some relaunching this month, others are in July, and finally some are taking a wait and see approach, because there's as you'd appreciate, there's a minimum capacity requirement to make any given venture a profitable venture for any operator. Due to the just sheer volume of operators in Cairns, there's fortunately been some sensible cooperation with talks of operating on alternate days, so that everyone as a whole can get a little bit. But ultimately, the success and viability of these industries need, as has been the message, planes, planes, planes. Next up is our restaurants. So restaurants, as was the case all around Australia, again closed immediately. We had some restaurants in Cairns that just had said that they would never do takeaway, they'd never be able to get the same quality of product, etc. They found that they needed to be adaptable, flexible, and agile, to use the buzzword. So we have seen a lot of these restaurants do pivot into takeaway. Some with actually pretty good success. So there's been a bit of community rallying around the restaurants from that. Some restaurants have now reopened, and others are holding off. The cut there seems to be the smaller format restaurants. They're more willing to reopen, whereas the larger ones are still holding out. Moving forward, there's a real possibility that there's going to be the business as usual plus takeaway and/or home delivery going forward. And unfortunately, some may never reopen. Pubs and clubs, again, immediately closed. That's not news to anyone. One of the larger clubs up here, Brothers Leagues Club, that's still closed as it's not viable with current number restrictions, although all the clubs are assessing this and keeping a very close eye on it. Todd and I live roughly in the same area, and our local pub seats about 300 diners. That's been closed as it's just not viable with the restrictions on place. But there is talk now about a reopening from this Friday. And in Cairns, the moment that the pubs are allowed to reopen, 5 hotels all in the same group did a bit of a package deal where there was a minimum spend, 10 people, $60 per head, and that received some pretty good take-up. Nightclubs, another big area of Cairns, closed immediately and are in all likelihood a fair way from reopening just due to the nature of business. End of season footy trips is going to be another hit, but who knows there, right? Like there's few things more sacred to football players than end of season trip. Just because the season never really got started doesn't mean that they're not necessarily going to want to do their end of season trip. And with Bali off the cards, why not Cairns? Other big tourism operators, again, all had to close immediately. As Todd mentioned earlier, Skyrail and the Corinda Scenic Railway are 2 of our larger tourist activities up here. Unless domestic numbers are sufficient to make it viable to reopen this year, it could very well be that they reopen next year. Obviously, JobKeeper is going to end between now and then on current expectations, so there's going to be a bit of a transition there unless some government stimulus comes in to help, or unless a lot of people get on planes and come up to Cairns and really support these businesses. Another major tourism operator is Capta Group up here. They own many attractions, so Rainforest Station, Wildlife Habitat Port Douglas, and the Cairns Zoo and Wildlife Dome. And they're reopening on 13 June with strictly limited numbers. So a bit of a creep back towards reopening. Accommodation providers, obviously heavily reliant upon tourists. At the moment, what we're hearing is that occupancy is 10% if lucky, more likely towards 5% or less. The Pacific Hotel is being used to quarantine people that are travelling up into the Cape, so at least they have a revenue stream. The Syrian billionaire that Todd mentioned earlier has spent a lot of money in the last 2 years on his 3 5-star hotels. One's closed until further notice. Another's been pushed back from March to October for its opening. And the third had initially about 6% occupancy and is effectively closed. And unfortunately, those 3 hotels employed 600 staff in March and had to lay off 470 shortly thereafter. We had a question before this session about the survival rate for accommodation businesses. And really, at the moment, it's a little bit too early to call. This is a bit of a black hole area and no one has any idea how deep it is yet. I guess the positive takeaway is that there's been really quite strong occupancy rates in recent years, although there had been a drop in 2019, which may have been related to a decrease in Chinese tourism compared to previous years. But again, this was coming off of a reasonably high base. A lot of the hotels in the area are owned by bigger operators like Hilton, so their ultimate position's not really known, but there's a lot of businesses that hold themselves out as hotels that are really management rights businesses. As far as management rights go, it's a real specialist area within our businesses. In the Cairns CBD, there's been a relatively successful switch to permanence, or otherwise getting very small numbers at low rates. This isn't as lucrative as your short stay people, but it's viewed to be enough to keep things ticking over. Especially for the management right owners themselves, so not the owners of the units, but the people running the management rights businesses. They also generally will receive from the body corporate a caretaker's allowance to keep, common areas tidy. That caretaker's allowance is often quite substantial and is potentially enough to keep things ticking over almost by itself. But as far as the owners themselves go, that's not helping the owners of the units. But there's always a degree of turnover in owners in a management rights complex. So while this may unfortunately cause some people to seriously consider selling, it's just as likely that there's going to be some catched up people that see this as an opportunity and will be able to jump back in. In the Cairns Northern Beaches and Port Douglas and down into the Whitsunday, these being more heavily reliant on tourism, it's pretty much dead. There is very, very minimal activity in these areas. The Cairns Convention Centre, quite a pillar of the Cairns CBD. Historically, it's been an important source of attracting tourists to Cairns through the hosting of conventions and other events. Pre-COVID-19, it announced its closure to complete its $176 million expansion and refurbishment. So the timing has worked out well. But the problem is the pipeline of future events coming into Cairns. That's been seen as well. Cairns has recently had a quite nice performing arts centre developed, and performances booked there are being cancelled on a case-by-case basis. So there's still shows that are booked and slated for later in the year that are still selling tickets, subject to potential closure later on. From a property and real estate angle, starting with residential, there's limited stock on the market, which has been helping to prop it up in terms of we haven't seen a fall in prices yet. As Todd mentioned, we've had a very slow grind to get back to pre-GFC levels. So we've been coming off a relatively low base as compared to capital cities. So while the limited stock, not helping our real estate agents, it is helping to mitigate some of the potential fall that we might have otherwise seen in property prices that may still yet come. From a commercial angle, there has definitely been reduced activity. Many of the Cairns businesses are either tourism or have links to tourism. So there's a lot of exposure amongst the tenants. As a lot of you will know, with this exposure and with COVID, that has had a heavy impact on rents and your ability to compel rents. So there's a great amount of uncertainty in this space. As far as buyers go, there is a bit of a perception in some quarters as banks are being fairly tight around lending practices relating to cans, which is also going to have an impact on commercial turnovers. Manufacturing, there's some softening occurring for some, but it hasn't had a huge impact yet on most businesses, although there is definitely supply chain issues. We've also seen some of the manufacturers pivot into COVID in demand products, which again might help mitigate some of the harm and damage in this space, but isn't likely to be, dollar for dollar compensation. So for example, we have a gin distillery up here that pivoted into hand sanitizer. Now I know that they would, well, I expect that they would have been preferring to have their pub full of people consuming their product, but again, it might be helping just to soften the blow. In the agri space, in North Queensland, it seems mostly to be unaffected in any material way so far. Maybe the export trade will be an issue for some, and there has been a few labour shortage issues, but not in Cairns and North Queensland as much as was expected. And that might be a mitigating factor from people that missed out on hospitality or tourism work, heading up into the tablelands and doing some agricultural work. As far as sugarcane goes, there's a risk, and this actually surprised me. There's a risk that the global oil price drop, partly due to reduced consumption in factories, plus cars not driving around as much, might see the production of ethanol being less competitive. And with Brazil focusing on sugar production, Brazil being one of the major global producers of sugarcane, they might end up pivoting away from ethanol and into sugar, which would have a dampening effect on sugar prices. As far as the immediate impact of that, most farmers have hedged their prices for this year. So that will prevent the immediate impact, but there may be an impact going into next year. Although in terms of the perception on the ground, we had a client that one of the partners he was speaking to, catching an update, how's everything going, how are you going with COVID? And the agriculturalist sugarcane farmer was just like, no, there's going to be no impact. I grow cane, I'm pretty well immune to it. And when the question was put, well, what if the mill that's responsible for the crush has a positive COVID-19 cluster and has to shut operations? That was the penny drop moment. So it may be that the perception isn't quite matching the reality yet. We've also, just as a note, we've also had a relatively late wet season. So it was dry earlier on in the season and has recently come on to be relatively wet. So the lack of the early rain may have an impact on the sugar content in the cane. And the impact of having a late wet is that it may cause havoc with the crush, which is due to start right now. In terms of other agricultural products, bananas are mostly being sold into the domestic market. There's been some anecdotal good support from consumers into bananas, so there hasn't really been a perceived material impact from COVID so far. As far as cattle, prices are strong, and indications are that there seems to be enough of a market to supply to, even with the recent rumblings out from China. Beef Central published an article last week that noted that global beef production was likely to reduce with less demand in declining economies. However, the Australian cattle market was more favourably placed with limited supply and improved seasonal conditions, allowing for strong cattle prices to be maintained. Equally, a related kind of livestock, buffalo, with the closure of all the restaurants, there's been a decrease in demand for buffalo products such as cheeses. There's actually a decent buffalo herd in North Queensland. So that's having an impact on the buffalo industry. Pumpkins. Bowen is well known for its mangoes, but it's also a major pumpkin hub. Halloween type pumpkins. There's been reports of some Halloween pumpkins being ploughed over due to a perceived lack of future demand. And as far as avocados go, some end of season picking just did not occur because the market dropped out unless you were supplying into Coles or Woolworths, and that's probably due to my generation not getting out and buying enough smashed avocado in cafes and restaurants. Major events. So as Todd mentioned earlier, the Chinese New Year just didn't happen. Cairns Amateurs, one of the major racing events in Cairns, has just announced that it's been cancelled, and this is the first time that that's ever happened. There's no conventions coming to Cairns, and Ironman Cairns, which I cannot overstate how big that is for Cairns. That's due to have occurred this coming weekend, but that's been pushed back to 27 September, and hopefully that happens because that's a major qualifying event for Ironman. As far as shipyards go, they're seemingly okay based off largely of Navy work and super yacht work. Professional services, and the immediate impact wasn't really felt, but the softening of the pipeline is going to bite. So parts of accounting and legal firms are seeing that now. As far as the engineers go, those that are exposed to government work may not see any softening until later, but private work has seen some softening. Medical practices are a bit of a mix. Some are doing quite well, some are seeing softening. Dentists, they had the mandatory close down as well. Dentists are considered to be relatively high risk of COVID impacts due to fishing around in people's mouths. But this has seen an opportunity for some dentists to do refurbs of their clinics, and also more cashed up dentists going around and acquiring other ones right now. Allied Health's also a bit of a mix. Some people are pivoting towards being able to go to allied health providers for massages and things like that, which might be helping. Gyms in Cairns, just like everywhere else, there's lots of gyms that are hoping to reopen soon. Retail, a lot were already struggling, especially with the pressure of online. Unless you're already online or pivoted quickly, you've likely got some major problems. However, things like food retail, so Domino's, especially in the suburbs, are going gangbusters. We spoke with someone who had one in the suburbs and one in the CBD. The initial immediate impact was suburb blew up, the one in the CBD softened, but the one in the CBD is now returning to a relative state of normality, whereas the suburbs are still going just as strong as ever. And we've also heard anecdotes that florists are seeing a bit of a renaissance, a bit of a boom, because you can't visit family, so sending flowers has become a big way of staying in touch. Others are also doing well through this, such as Woolworths, Coles. Hoarding has helped. Building and construction, some local tradies are as busy as ever, and pardon the pun, but some renovation type work is going through the roof. Businesses that supply DIY materials are also doing well, but there's a slowdown likely coming around the new homes, subject to the stimulus that's being mooted at the moment. Large builders and tradies that mostly work on the larger builders may see a bit of a pinch. And I'll now hand you back to Todd to do a bit of a lap of the other regions throughout North Queensland.
Okay, so far we've really been talking about here, Cairns, but let's look at what's happening around Cairns. So if we go for a virtual drive in our car, and we go about an hour up the road from Cairns, we get to Port Douglas. If I had to describe that, you said, give me one word, dead. If you said, Todd, I'll give you 2 words, ghost town. It is very quiet up there. They are currently checking on these changes to numbers, how that will look. And so some restaurants are now starting to look at whether they can reopen or whether they should just sit back and wait. Because the problem they've got is that the announcement last Sunday was just things are changing midday the following day, and people haven't had a chance to plan their trips. So there could potentially be a 1 month, 2 month or longer lag for people to now book their holidays from Brisbane, Sydney, from Brisbane, I'll come to the point later on, and to actually get up here to Cairns, Port Douglas, Airlie Beach. So what they have seen is that bookings were cancelled at a very fast rate. Port Douglas needs flights happening as quickly as possible. And it's one area that I try to explain to my friends down south where we need the Queensland state border to reopen. Why? Because unlike other areas, the largest proportion of our tourists are from Victoria and New South Wales. If I look at figures from last year, Brisbane tourists into Cairns and the area was about 246,000. Melbourne was the same and Sydney was slightly less. So, you know, saying that we're open intrastate, as in Queensland only, for tourism only goes a very small part of the way, because places like Port Douglas, and I'll talk about Airlie Beach later on, really need domestic tourists from Victoria who escape the cold in these winter months and come up here in hordes. So that's definitely something that is a main push from up here, is the opening of the state borders, because that's probably where the majority of their tourists are coming from. If I hop in my virtual car and we drive an hour west, we're up on the Atherton Tablelands. That's where we're seeing less of an impact, because tourism is not a big factor. They are more reliant on agriculture, which, as I said before, has had not that much of an impact. If we go north into the Cape, Weipa. So Weipa predominantly is travelling okay because they have Rio Tinto and mining operations leading the way. So it's not seen a drop like we may have seen in other regions. But in Weipa, there is concerns for the tourism operators up there, because they certainly do have a few of those. We actually have been approached to put in a submission to provide advisory services to help local tourism operators up there as to things like assessing where they currently stand financially and looking at producing those people business plans and that, so that they can be sustainable in the future once this changes and that. So the other thing we've got to remember in the Cape, and it's not just the Cape, because there's the Cape, Cooktown Shire, which is just north of us here, but also Yarrabah, which is, as the crow flies, is probably only about 6 kilometres from Cairns. That's right, it's at 6 kilometres from Cairns. They are in total lockdown. So they have biosecurity there. So if we look at Weipa and trying to get business started, the current regulations are, even if I live in Weipa and I have a house there and I happen to travel down to Cairns, I must self-quarantine for 14 days in an approved building before I can go back to my home in Weipa. If I'm say from Cairns looking at doing business in Weipa, I not only have to self-quarantine for that 14-day period in an approved building like a hotel, but I also have to prove up that why I want to go there is actually critical. And so those areas are trying to get those biosecurity measures relaxed. Certainly happening in Yarrabah. I read in today's Cairns Post that Cooktown and that Shire is pushing hard for that, as I am also aware is happening in Weipa and other parts of the Gulf and that. If I travel with my car 4 hours south to Townsville, Townsville hasn't had the same impact from COVID-19 as, say, Cairns and that, because it's not as reliant on tourism. Townsville has mining, Defence Force, other government departments like the ATO, health and education, and they're all leading the way. Where Townsville, I understand, has had an issue is discretionary spend businesses. So obviously things like cafes and restaurants and a few other things like that. The other area to consider, or the other issue to consider for Townsville, is that there are still some businesses impacted on the floods last year. that either haven't got back on their feet or haven't even received, from what I've been told, their insurance yet. So for those businesses, they're certainly going to be at higher risk. Heading further south to Mackay and the Whitsundays. So Mackay seems to be going okay at the moment on back of mining, but Mackay, the key watch for the Mackay economy is about international coal prices. So there's this constant watch to making sure that coal price doesn't fall to a level where those mines go into care and maintenance, because that will then become a big issue for that area. If we go slightly north of Mackay to Airlie Beach and the Whitsundays, you're just talking like we're talking about Port Douglas, basically dead. Airlie Beach itself, it just can't be viable, in my opinion, just relying on the domestic tourism market, and certainly can't be that way if they can't very shortly get visitors arriving from Victoria and New South Wales. Because bear in mind here, there is going to be this lag between when borders reopen, people want to come up here, people make their bookings, etc., etc. So where to from here? So, I mean, does anyone have a fully functional crystal ball? Because really, there's so much uncertainty at the moment. What I can probably be reasonably confident of is that Townsville, Mackay, and Weipa, subject to any downturn in mining, should recover quicker through mining government services than areas like Cairns, Airlie Beach, and Port Douglas that rely more heavily on tourism. But no one should be expecting to see an immediate huge influx of domestic and international travellers to visit Cairns once these restrictions are relaxed. We're probably talking up here that we're not looking at international travel occurring till potentially 12 months' time at least. So, I mean, that's going to have a major impact on those tourism areas that do rely on international travellers. And just because my local pub or my community market or restaurant may open soon, I'm not sure if myself or anyone else will be keen just to rush on down at the first opportunity. So once again, there will be this lag, there will be some level of cautiousness. So what do we want? So from Cairns itself and around this area, where I'm talking from, we just want planes, more planes. Give us as many planes as you've got. Because those Cairns businesses with a tourism focus may see little of the peak tourism season that starts now. So the winter months are our peak tourism season. Mostly, I'm not saying for everyone, but for those tourism operators, this is a peak season for them. And so they may miss out entirely on this peak season. We've got a large casual workforce, which is currently being propped up by JobKeeper. So what jobs will those employees have when that stops? Don't know yet. We need domestic flights travelling to Cairns from not only Queensland, but all around the country. So we are desperate for state borders to be reopened because we rely heavily on Victorians and the New South Wales tourists, okay? And there needs, and we have this need still for continued state and federal support packages and major project funding. So this next slide talks about, is there a debt cliff coming? Because the current support offered by governments, banks, landlords will at some stage have to drop off. Now, there's talk of the government considering extending financial support into specific regions. And if that's the case, you'd have to expect Cairns would be one of those. Now, we have a question that someone online has asked about, do we have an estimate of the level of government assistance required, and what is the balance point? How much is affordable versus self-help? So that's probably what my next dot point on the slide talks about is, you know, like, what does that look like? So what people are talking about is really probably an extension of JobKeeper, but in a modified form. So we have a lot of casual workers up here who may only be earning $400 to $500 a week, but are now getting paid under JobKeeper $750 a week, and that just doesn't sit right with me. So if it was to carry on, then that would need to be looked at. I don't have, you know, an estimate of what government assistance is required, but we're probably looking at a focus into Cairns as a specific region, and then maybe just tourism-based operations, drilling down further than that. And I think in regards to that question about self-help, yeah, I mean, I've got the same question about, well, are we just kicking the can of the problem down the road a few months? And shouldn't people, at some stage, have to look inward and say, okay, now's the time I've got to stand on my own 2 feet. And the points on this slide, which I haven't talked about yet, which I'll talk about now, is really, I think from a banker's point of view and from an advisor's point of view and from the business owner's point of view, they've got to be looking at where my business was at financially pre-COVID-19, because those who have got a weak balance sheet pre-COVID-19, who had underlying issues around profitability and cash flow and may have not even gone and fixed those problems up, are clearly going to be at a higher credit risk. And that's probably one of my concerns, is that you've got all, I wouldn't say it's free cash flowing in, but it certainly is propping up things artificially. It can't last forever. And at some stage, someone's going to have to pay the piper. And I'm just not sure what the impact will be yet. I mean, I'm hearing different things as to, will there be a major flood of potential insolvencies and closures coming around September, or will that potentially push back to February or March next year? I think everyone's expecting it's coming. We're just not sure in what form, timing, and size it's coming yet. Because potentially there's a large number of Cairns businesses that may never reopen. In regards to my final comments, concluding thoughts, so Cairns and other tourism-based centres up here in North Queensland do have a long road ahead of them, okay? Some of these local businesses in Cairns around tourism survive a large part year in, year out of what they earn in these peak winter tourist months, which are these next three or 4 months. Now, they potentially may miss out entirely on that, or see very little as compared to previous months. Now, businesses would need to have plans in place, not only around how to reopen, but also a plan to basically address any underlying financial issues. My concern I have is that, talking about Cairns, is that I think many business owners up here will struggle with that. I mean, they'll struggle with at least one of them, about formulating a plan to reopen, let alone, if they get asked the question by their banker or their accountant. So you had this underlying financial issue pre-COVID. What exactly have you done over the last 4 months, 6 months to fix that? And so I really think it's important in regards to both of those objectives that those business owners, go seeking advice now, so they can map out their future pathway, rather than pushing those questions down the path to, say, August or September, and then rocking up to the bank saying, okay, I've got to start paying you guys back, but I really don't have a clear pathway. I'm not sure if that's going to be acceptable. Again, I want to say again that Cairns has experienced and overcome significant challenges before, like the pilot strike. Parts of Cairns are hurting, and yes, there is uncertainty. Mostly that's driven around tourism. Port Douglas and Airlie Beach are doing worse than Cairns. And these local businesses have seen a lot of really large changes to the business environment in a short period of time. So the return to what is the new normal could be slow and gradual, and therefore it may take years for some of these businesses, particularly around tourism, to get back to where they were. I do want to emphasise again, as I close off this presentation, that it's not all doom and gloom in Cairns, okay? So some businesses up here are doing fine. But what we do need in northern Queensland is an influx of tourists from all around Australia to give those tourism-dependent businesses the best chance of survival. If you have any questions or queries, let us know. It may be easier if you just drop us an email or give us a call. You've got our information there, and these slides will be distributed to you shortly. So if you have any queries on that, please take the opportunity to make contact with us. Now, next week, we are going to move into industry overviews. So we're going to run a second round of presentations looking at specific industries, and that may be for the next 2 or 4 weeks based on your feedback. The first one next week will be run by Roger and Alistair from BDO in Brisbane, and they're all over the topic of hospitality, accommodation, and tourism. So that should be something that I think everyone should tune into and register for. Thank you for your time today, and I hope for the last 45 minutes or so that you've got a better understanding of what's happening in Cairns and also other parts of North Queensland. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.